Okay, so we are going to get started. Thank you for giving up your afternoon to talk about meaningful assessments. For those of you who don't know me very well, my name is Dr. Kimberley Davis, and I'm the assessment and feedback guru. I like guru better than expert. I'm the assessment and feedback guru for the office. And today, what we're going to talk about is how to design meaningful assessments to help promote academic integrity. So we know that with the rise of doing things online, doing assessments online, we've also seen a rise in plagiarism and collusion and some of these opportunities that we didn't have to necessarily think about before when we were running our exams in, lecture halls and things like that. And when we were assessing in different ways. So I thought we'd spend a little bit of time today talking about how we might think of assessments in a different way and what that can mean for reducing these instances of plagiarism and academic dishonesty. So the first thing I want us to really think about is what I mean when I say meaningful assessment. So some of you who have been with me before or heard me ramble on about assessment will know that for our university, we use meaningful assessment the way you might have heard authentic assessment. So you may have heard the term authentic assessment before. We use meaningful assessment on campus because all of the assessment that you do is authentic. It gets authenticated by outside governing bodies. It goes through the learning and teaching committees. It goes through a scrutiny process. So technically, using the word authentic has a very different connotation. And I don't like to imply that assessments that people are doing are not authentic. So we use meaningful. But in this case, what it refers to is assessment tasks that involve real world context. So helping your students connect their skills and connect what they are doing in our classrooms to what they will be doing in the real world and what they might be doing when they enter the working world. And it's allowing them to, demonstrate their skills, demonstrate that knowledge, but do so in a way that they can easily connect. This also means that it's kind of is a task that goes outside of the traditional exam type format or the traditional essay type formats for assessments. But what I also want you to think about in terms of meaningful assessment is thinking about what our students need to be able to demonstrate. So what are they going to do with these skills? How do they show us that they've learned them and learned them to the degree that we need them to learn? And how do we know that they will be able to, demonstrate them again, rather than just having kind of memorized them for a one shot, just do it for the assessment and then they'll never remember it again. The other thing I want you to think about is, although we're going to talk about alternative methods of assessments that shy away from the typical traditional exam type settings, sometimes the most meaningful assessment you can do with your students is an exam. Okay, so there's things you need to consider, and there are questions that you need to ask yourself to see what's going to be the most meaningful way for the students to demonstrate their knowledge. Because at the end of the day, that's the important thing. That's the important part of the assessment. It's making sure that our students can show off and say, look how well I've learned this. Now I can do these skills, or now I can complete this task, which is going to help me as I move through the program and when I enter the working world. Sometimes that does take the form of an exam, because some of you might be working with a cohort of 250 students or 500 students. I had someone once from an engineering course that had 650 students on their course. You can't really be doing lots of real world task simulation type assessments with 650 students, right? So you also have to consider your environment, the level of your students, your resources, so marking teams, how much time you can spend marking assessments. All of those things also are part of that consideration for what makes a meaningful assessment. So, but I do want us to start thinking kind of beyond exams and start thinking about how you might be able to create these meaningful assessment tasks and what they might look like in your context. So the first thing you really want to think about is, why are you teaching your students this content? So why are they sitting in your class? What is the purpose of that? Usually we will look to the intended learning outcomes for this. So the ILOs are going to play a big part in why you're teaching your students this content, but it will go beyond that as well. So this then also ties with your ILOs, and that's what you want them to learn. So what do you want them to know? What do you want them to understand? What should they be able to do at the end of your course? What skills should they have? And to what degree should they be able to demonstrate that? So some of you may be teaching foundational skills courses where you don't need them to have, a super mastery yet of it, because they're going to build their skills throughout, but you need them to start having that foundational knowledge, or you're the next piece in the puzzle. They've taken a foundational course and now you're going to sharpen, hone, and expand the skills that they have. So thinking about that becomes really important. In terms of the assessment, how do we get the students to prove that they get it? So what does that look like? What would a mastery of these skills that you want them to be able to demonstrate, or the concepts you want them to understand, how do they show that to you? How do they show you, yes, they've got it? And then the part that then becomes thinking about it in terms of a meaningful task is, how do you connect it to real world work environment that they might, find themselves in and have to demonstrate these skills? So how can you then get them to see what this looks like in a real world context? And then you want to think about where this course and where your assessment fits into the wider program and the students' learning. So again, this is thinking, is it building on current skills? Is it preparing them for future assessments that they'll have, or future skills they're going to need to learn? I always think about, if you're working in chemistry, you teach the students the periodic table and understanding the elements before you get them actually using them in experiments. So that type of thing, thinking about where you fit within the overall program and where you can make these connections for future tasks or for the learning that they've done prior to entering your class. And what you will, the answers that you come up with, the answers and the way you think about this is then going to help you think about the type of assessment that might be most appropriate for your students. And this is thinking about different methods, different ways of presentation, what skill sets and what your expectations for demonstrating those skill sets are. So this is a handy checklist to have when you first sit down and start to think about what type of assessment you might want to design. The next thing that you really want to think about, and again, those of you who have ever had a PGCAP course with me know that I love constructive alignment. So the idea of how your intended learning outcomes, your assessment, and the way you deliver course content all work together. So if you're thinking of constructive alignment like a puzzle, then each of these pieces, the ILOs, the content that you're delivering and the way you deliver it, and your assessments are each pieces of that puzzle. And when put together, it makes the very beautiful picture of your course. So in order to make sure that you have that constructive alignment element, and to make sure that you are really thinking about the skills that are important. You want to make sure that you are assessing all of the ILOs in the summative tasks. So you don't want an ILO that's only assessed in a formative task, as those are often non-compulsory tasks. And if students don't complete the formative, then we have no way of knowing if they've actually met the intended learning outcome. So that's why you want to make sure they're all covered within the assessments. If you're doing more than one assessment, you might choose to break up some, one ILO might be covered in one assessment, the rest might be covered in another, it might be one or two, just as long as by the time the students have completed the course and been assessed, they have demonstrated all of these ILOs. So this will also help you determine the type of assessment that you want to use, because you're going to be asking for different skill sets, or your students will be able to demonstrate different skill sets for your course, and those can be assessed in a variety of ways. The other thing to think about is the type of assessment that you're doing. And I want you to think about the assessment as falling into the following three categories. So assessment of learning. Anyone think they know what this means? Okay, so think of assessment of learning as the types of assessments that you would do with exams or multiple choice questions. So this is making sure your students have a mastery of concepts or ideas. So foundational concepts or skills, or being able to demonstrate that they've understood the definition of terms and things like that. So think of the assessment of learning as checking to make sure they have the skills, or have the information that's going to be important moving forward. Your assessment for learning then adds a component to that where the assessment is also part of the learning process. So there are things they have to do in the assessment that are going to also allow them to demonstrate their skills. So if you're having them write a report, right? It's knowing the structure of the report, knowing the terminology to use, understanding what each section of the report needs to have, as well as the information that you're asking them to present. This is the type of assessment that we hope to move people towards with the creation of meaningful assessment tasks. The last one is assessment as learning. And think of this as a PhD or a final year project where the students create all of, they design the study, they make the research questions, they go and carry out the research, they analyze the research, they write up the research, and then they are assessed based on what they have created. And all of the questions come from that, data generation and that project completion. Okay, that one is not as common outside of final year projects, and it is most common in a PhD where students are part of every aspect of the assessment, right? So the students, they basically create the work that will be assessed in its entirety. So again, having an understanding of what type of assessment you want to do, what skills are important. Is it recall? Is it them carrying out a set of tasks in a specific way? Is it them designing something from start to finish? This will also help you to think about the type of assessment that you might want to use. And this will also help you start to think about too, there are things where the assessment of learning is going to be exactly what you need. think of quizzes at the end of, a block of teaching or at the end of a chapter. That's assessment of learning, but it's very important to assess that learning because that can give you a whole lot of information about how well the students have taken in the knowledge. And if there's anything you need to go back to, if there's anything that you need to cover again, if there's questions you need to ask the students about how well they are understanding, the material. So I don't want you to think that I'm simply saying, oh, you can never do assessment of learning tasks, or you can never use, traditional exam type assessments, because that's not true. I just want you to think beyond this where appropriate, and think about how you are using it and how you explain this to your students and what that will do in terms of helping you design out plagiarism, but also helping you connect the skills that are important to what they will be doing when they leave the four metaphorical walls of our classroom. So the next thing I want you to do is, when you're sitting down to think about this, is to ask yourself some more questions. So this is a lot of thinking done on your part, but the first one is, what's important in terms of what you're assessing and how you're going to assess. So is it that they can tell you that they understand a concept, or is it that they can demonstrate how to do something? So how, what's going to be important, or are both of those things important? And that again will help you think about methods. Do you want to assess something that students produce? So do you want them to create something, and in that creation, you'll see how they've met the ILOs? Or is it a process they have to follow through? So is it an experiment they have to run? Is it, if you're working in maths, is it some sort of equation that they have to work through? What is it that becomes important? And what will that outcome look like? And then thinking about things like, what is also important in that? So is it their writing ability? Is it how well they speak? So if you're doing an oral presentation or some kind of, video recording, are you looking at the way, they present themselves, how well they present material, how creative they can be, how they use technology, how are they looking at any visual components that need to be added? Can they work in a group or team? So some of you may have larger cohorts, but have group work or have a group assignment. So how well do students work together in that situation to complete the assessment? And can they do things if there's a time constraint? So for some of you, you're using multiple choice questions. They have a minute per question. How well do students do in that type of time frame? If you've got, if you are doing an exam, and they've got a 3-hour exam, how well will they be able to answer all of the questions that need to be answered within that 3-hour time period? If you're doing things like a presentation and they've got 10 minutes to present or 5 minutes, can they present all the information within that time frame? So how well can they get their learning across within those constraints? And these are all, again, things to consider that are going to help you then think about what method of assessment is going to be important, what things you're going to then assess and include in a rubric. All of this will help you also be able to think about, well, what are the students going to do in that real world context? Because that also then determines what types of skills you may focus on, what things become important. Any questions so far? Okay, good. You can always pop them into the chat as well if you think of anything you want to ask. So what I've given you now, and we're going to breeze through these few slides kind of quickly, because at the end of this session, I will send you a Word document with all of these, but I've provided some examples of alternative assessment formats that you might want to consider having your students do, things that might show off their skills a bit, you know, in a more meaningful way. Now, the thing I will say about this is, depending on what you are teaching, the level of students, and your environment, some of these things may not work for you. So this isn't meant to be a list of all of these things are going to work in every context. What we've put together, and this was put together by Amanda Sykes, based on a paper that was published around, you know, thinking about high stakes assessment. And what this is just an alphabetized list of all different types of assessment methods, and why it might be useful for your students, how you might start to think about, you know, these tasks in a meaningful way for them, and the way it assesses them. So you can think about those questions that I gave you in the previous slide about what's important to assess. And you can kind of match them to the different types of activities that you might do. So you'll see all kinds of things. There's all kinds of different types of assessments and ways to think about them that you might find useful for your context. So I'll just breeze through them pretty quickly. You'll have these slides, and like I said, I'll send you the Word document that was created that also has these in a slightly larger / more accessible format. But it's just really thinking kind of outside the box for some of these, or thinking about, you know, what this might do in terms of allowing your students to engage with the content in a slightly different way. And there's all kinds of fun things. Some of these things you'll already be doing, or they'll look very familiar. And again, this doesn't mean you necessarily have to give up the traditional exam if that is going to be the most meaningful way for you to be able to assess your students. Because at the end of the day, that's the important part. Can you connect it to real world tasks? You know, yes, that's what we would like, but if you have 650 students, you're not going to be able to assess them that way, and you'll have to make those connections to real world skills and what they'll do in a different way. And you do that during the lecture, you do that with some of the activities you ask them to do, but you won't necessarily be able to do that with the assessment itself, and that's okay. So those are things that still have to be taken into consideration when you are, you know, looking at these types of things. So again, just all kinds, there's a whole range of things that you can do and you can think about. There are a lot of things, so like wikis and things like that. There are Moodle plugins that you can use, and that will help you with the setup and maintenance of these, and, you know, allow students to then contribute. So Moodle does a lot of these things and can offer a lot of help in creating these assessment tasks as well. So the other thing I want you to start to think about is how to think about utilizing continuous assessment methods. So if you're moving away from the more traditional exam, and you're breaking up your assessments into smaller tasks, you know, how might you and when might you assess the students at different points within a course? So where does it make sense to kind of chunk their information and the learning content and then assess them? Or how might you get them to do things in small stages so that by the time it gets to the, you know, end of semester, they can put all of these smaller assessments together into one big piece of work. So working on a draft of an essay as they go, or if they're writing a report, they're writing it in stages. And they're working on a couple of sections at a time, so that by the time the end of the semester rolls around, then they just have to finish it off and, put it all together. And then they've worked on it across the entire semester rather than just cramming it in at the end. The other thing to think about is, again, those of you who've been on the PG Cap with me know that I love to talk about the number of assessments versus the number of credits in your course. So in some courses, if you have a 10 credit course, it's not always appropriate to do more than one assessment. And if that's the case, then how can you utilize formative assessment tasks to help your students get the chance to practice that and get a chance to get stuck in and get familiar with the assessment method, get some feedback, really think about, what that means and why they're being asked to do certain things, how it demonstrates these skills. And again, with the last point, this is what's going to, I think, really aid in your students' engagement with the assessments and their learning, is helping them become assessment literate. So if they understand what's expected of them, why they're being assessed in a certain way, how it's allowing them to demonstrate those skills, how it connects to either what they're going to do later in the program or what they're going to do, out in practice, all of these things can then help them be able to engage in a deeper way and get to the important part of the assessment, which is that demonstration of knowledge. So you don't want your students to have to decode the assessment before they can even start answering the questions you've put to them, unless that's part of the assignment. If part of the assignment is being able to read information and figure out what's being asked, if it's a case scenario, if you are, working in, a practical lab, I'm thinking doctors, vets, dentists, when you take a patient history and you have to figure out from that history how to proceed, that might be part of the assessment, is decoding what's actually wrong and what actually needs to be done. But if that's not the case, you want it to be as clear as possible for the students so that they focus on engaging with that demonstration of knowledge and showing you how brilliant they are, because that's what we want from the assessments, hopefully. So then you might be thinking, how does that then relate to plagiarism? And here's the thing: meaningful assessments and connecting it to real world tasks often then allow the students to put themselves in that place. So if I'm in the working world, here's what I'm going to do. And it becomes more personal. The responses become more personal. What you're looking for becomes different. The way you are engaging with the course content and the skills that they need to learn becomes different. And you're allowing them the chance to really be engaged with it and be a part of it. One of the things that there are some simple things to think about in terms of how you might design out plagiarism. And one of those is, avoiding that opportunity to submit something that already exists. So if they've written a report in another class, or or there's something that's on Dr. Google that can find them, exactly what you're asking for, trying to get rid of that, trying to make it as, original and unique to their situation as, to their cohort as possible is, something that's going to really, be helpful. This also includes things like making sure that you're not, reusing the same type of assessment questions or things where they could go and get the answers from somebody else and then use them. thinking, and here's where the meaningful tasks come in, because if you're looking at things where they actually have to create something and explain it and talk through it and present it, then you're looking at methods where, you know, plagiarism is much harder to do. So thinking about, you know, how you might minimize that, and how you might really think about, you know, what it means to write these questions, and thinking about those methods. The other thing is, this is why I talked to you about continuous assessment. So if you're linking tasks, so things build on each other, they're doing it in, you know, small pieces and moving along as they learn. When they do that, they feel less overwhelmed with having to do something all at once, which then kind of helps them stay away, hopefully, from plagiarism. Using methods that track what they're doing. So they have to write a reflective journal, they have to, you know, show you drafts, they have to post their work as they go on a forum for you to see. You know, anything like that where you can see how they're working and see how they're moving through an assignment can be helpful. Methods for the students to create, you know, individual artifacts for them to, you know, use those to demonstrate the concepts. Anytime you can get them to build something or create something, that can be helpful. Asking for them to, you know, take part in formative opportunities where they get to practice, they get some feedback, it doesn't affect their overall grade. And they can see if they're headed in the right direction or not. These are all going to be very good. Throwing in some reflective questions as well. So not, you know, not all of you will be able to have something, you know, have a type of assessment where students get to create something from scratch, or, you know, some of you work in subjects where there is only one right answer. So no matter what you do, the you know, the concept they need to know, what they need to understand, really only has one right answer, right? 2 + 2 always going to equal 4, unless it doesn't. And please don't tell me, because I can't handle that. But that is something that would easily be Googleable, right? That's always going to give you the answer. But if you get students to reflect on how they know that, or in some instances, you get them to cite where they found that information. So open book exams, which are a lot more difficult than closed book exams, or building in, you have to cite your sources, and you will be marked also on the quality of sources. So you know that they're not just kind of taking the first thing that comes off of Google, but they've really, you know, thought about how they got help and where they got help, and, you know, how they've incorporated that into their answer. Anytime you can add those into it is going to be helpful. And the last thing is authentication exercises. So using things like Turnitin, where students have to submit their work, and then we can see, you know, a score, a similarity report, they can see it, and anything like that where it also reminds them, hey, we have ways to check on this, so please don't do it. And the last thing, which you might think is very obvious, but is surprisingly not, is explaining what plagiarism is to the students. So we all have it in our course handbooks. It's in program handbooks. It's on the Senate office website. It's part of the university regulations. It's in the assessment code of practice. But we can't always guarantee that our students have read all of those things, even though they have access to all of them. And we do know that in some cultures, plagiarism is not a concept that they've ever been introduced to before. We know that in certain cultures, there is one right answer. You've copied, you've pasted, you presented, that's the right answer. That's what it should be. That's how we know. Here you go. And it's just, you know, citing sources and not just kind of straight copy and paste. That's how they're used to doing things. That's what's expected. So for some of them, this introduction to plagiarism, brand new, first time they're hearing of it. So taking the time to just remind them of that, to set the expectation of, before you came here, you may have been used to doing it this way, but for us in the Glasgow context, or in the context of this course, this is what plagiarism is. This is what we don't want you to do. This is how we expect you to engage with the assessments, with coursework, and reminding them that there are places that they can go on campus that will help them with learning about plagiarism. So student learning and development, the counterpoint to our academic and digital development team, they do a lot of great work around helping students understand plagiarism. So making sure links like that are available to students, pointing them in that direction. They also do an amazing academic writing program where students can go through and help strengthen their skills in academic writing and learn how to get those skills and feel confident doing that. So pointing students in that direction, setting those expectations as well, those are going to be things that, really help our students feel comfortable engaging and feel, a little bit less like they need to resort to plagiarism, hopefully. Now, the other thing that I will say is, short of saying, create an interpretive dance right now in front of me from scratch while I watch you on Zoom, it's hard to have an assessment that is going to be 100%, free from the opportunity to collude, free from, the opportunity to plagiarize. So some of it, things like asking them to use sources then and to cite things if they're going to be using, the internet anyway, asking them to reflect, asking them different types of questions where it really is up to them to explain their process and explain, how they worked through something, or, how they found a source that they thought was trustworthy enough to use to help them answer a question. Giving them that reflective bit and giving them a chance to engage in a different way, using sources, all of those things can help, again, kind of design out the plagiarism aspect, because students have options that they know they're allowed to use, so they will use them. And with that, I will now open it up to questions or comments or concerns that you may have around either designing meaningful assessments or the ever fun plagiarism issue. So now the floor is yours. Yeah, Julia.
Thanks for mentioning student learning development. What's the counter? You mentioned counterpoints in people that can help students with plagiarism.
Oh, yeah. So student learning and development, they have a plagiarism, like a little workshop that they do that will.
Is that do you mean the good academic practice, the Moodle?
So there's a Moodle course, but I believe they have a whole kind of Moodle work through that discusses plagiarism, specifically.
Yeah.
Plagiarism. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Because I think it just got revamped. So I think it also includes things like the online assessments and kind of the stuff that is propped up during the pandemic and some of those worries. So they also have like practice exam, practice question type things where students.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. It's really, I think, it's really good. I think there's some really good stuff on there, and letting students know that that's something they can engage with, I think it's really important. Or if you're going to be the one that, talks through plagiarism with your students, you can go there to see kind of what the resources are, and you can, use that to help discuss it. Because I do think they do a lot.
I need to open my the bell just ringing. I just need to open the door back in a sec.
Dick, do you have a question or comment or
If,
concern?
if, if, if you actually, I was making some notes. So basically, one thing that sort of struck me is plagiarism was actually what we were aiming students to do, but without access to the original document when they were writing. Because that's basically what an exam is. It's plagiarism based on, or a lot of them were. In fact, I seem to remember. I can't remember. I think it was my cousin. Because my family, I used to have a photographic memory, but it went as I got older. But I think my cousin had an amazing photographic memory. And he had a real issue in exam when he pretty much verbatim copied a book chapter, and they wouldn't believe that he'd actually recalled it. But it was under exam conditions, so they had to believe it.
Yeah.
But then you think about it, that is pure plagiarism. It's just your memory is that good that you are plagiarizing and not necessarily storing any of it. And certainly as a family, you do find that you often cheat in some ways because you can recall stuff without really understanding it, and
Yeah.
that's probably not the best way of learning it. Um, One of the things that's sort of problem in the life sciences is that there's still very much an exam bias. So I don't have anything to do with setting any vet examinations, but I do the veterinary bioscience equine stuff, and it's all basically MCQs and short answer questions and all the rest of it. And when I helped set some of them the year before, the year before this one, they said all these lists of things that how we should be doing MCQs and how we should be writing essay questions, all the rest of it, and which are general guidelines, which I don't think are written down anywhere and don't seem to exist. So it is quite difficult. But one comment they did have is that so I'm real. In Cambridge, loved MCQs. So we had so many MCQs. We had an exam every 4 weeks for the last 3 years, and MCQs the only way they could mark it. But my issue was I don't mind the MCQs where you have 4 right answers and one wrong answer. No, 4 wrong answers and one right answer. The other way around is, particularly if you get somebody with a photographic memory, it's a terrible way to learn because you see 4 wrong things, you do past papers, and it's awful.
Yeah.
You say, "Oh, I remember reading that." It's like, "Oh, but it was wrong because it was an MCQ question."
Yeah. So
Um,
there's that issue,
mm,
definitely. Um, and there I spend a lot of time with people who think the exam or MCQs, those are multiple choice questions are the only way I can do this. That's the only way. Now, for some, in the vet school, in med school, in the dental school, some in the business school and engineering, if you have a very strict outside regulatory body that is part of your accreditation team, if you're accredited by one of them,
yeah.
sometimes some of them are very strict about how you can assess what that looks like. It's an exam, it's OSCEs, it's
Mm,
multiple choice questions. And sometimes they also design these assessments around the exams, the licensing exams, and things that students will then face after they graduate to finish the accreditation process to become to become certified in the field. So I do understand that. And in that case, then it's about making sure we write the strongest multiple choice questions we can,
mm.
or the strongest exam questions that are going to, not be so, kind of informal that students could not know what to write and then write anything, or that they're so detailed that they're locked into one specific answer and then everything's going to look the same and you're not really sure if anybody learned anything. So then,
The problem is just the numbers of the vets. This is sorry to interrupt you, Kim, but it's difficult to see sometimes, isn't it? Is you talk to the older vets, and I remember talking to one of them. He said one of my final exams was to spay a bitch. So you had a dead bitch, and you spayed it on the table, and they marked on how well you did all your sutures and you did everything else. Whereas it's much better assessment of learning than writing an essay about it, which is probably the nearest equivalent you have now. But for 170 final years, it's not going to happen.
no. So that, in a perfect world, I often say sometimes, like, in utopia, how might you design these
Mm,
assessments? But in the real world, how does this work? Because if I'm training to be a doctor, which nobody wants me to do, like, right, I can write an assessment, I can write an essay about how you do brain surgery. I could totally write you an essay right now that explains that, what you need to do, what it looks like, you know but do you want to put a scalpel in my hand? Because I don't want to put a scalpel in my hand. So I'd much rather the future doctor who performed brain surgery rather than me who just wrote about how to do it, but
Mm.
actually did. Because yeah, I wouldn't trust me. Wouldn't
I think
trust me.
we're finding I'm the level 1 biology lead, so I have vet bioscience students in the class. So we have over 700
Yeah.
so in the class. So, but what we find with plagiarism, it's mainly students who are working and who are doing it last minute and just grabbing some resources. So, we do tell them about plagiarism and what it is. Not everybody understands it, and the plagiarism process is quite supportive in first year. And I actually think it's a good thing for some of our students to go through that process so that they get time with a couple of members of staff to go through what their issues are. And I've had students come back and thank us afterwards to say, thanks very much, I just didn't quite get it. But we have two extremes. We have the ones who know they're doing it and just trying to, because their time, they're working so many hours.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Yeah, it is. And that, I think part of this too, this is why then the formative assessments and formative tasks, where you can fit them in and where they're appropriate become very important, because you can catch some of that plagiarism before it really, has ultra serious consequences. And you can, put them through that process where they have that chat and they see what's wrong with what they've done, and then it doesn't necessarily kind of mess up their entire academic career, because it's a very serious thing. And so I think that is important too, to acknowledge that people's reasons for plagiarizing come in a variety of forms. And we will face students, our Middle Eastern and our Asian students. For them, that's not a thing. Plagiarism is not a thing, and they've never encountered that before. And if they haven't been, if they haven't done a degree outside of their home country before, they might not have ever encountered that. And acknowledging that, and acknowledging that it's going to be a foreign concept for them, literally, and they may not get it right the first time. So also kind of having that understanding as well can help with how we respond to it. Because if someone's gone the first 17 years of their life without that being a thing, and they're told, hey, by the way, that thing you've done your whole life, you can't do that anymore.
Well, it's a self-plagiarism. I think that it surprises a lot of people, because it's like, well, I submitted this before, but I wrote it. It's like, but that's still not permitted unless it is permitted.
Yeah.
I've certainly done that in the past without realizing.
Yeah. So I tend to take a bit of a different view of self-plagiarism, in that I will tell people, like, I don't want to see the exact same thing that you've just submitted, but if you use that and you cite yourself where you've written other things and you're using bits of it to help you, then that's okay. But I tend to be slightly lenient about self-plagiarism, and the fact that I will let them do it as long as they cite themselves, which sounds weird, but as long as they acknowledge that this little piece they've taken here, and it can't be a majority of their assignment. It can be, a paragraph, it can be some little bits here and there, but it can't be the majority of the assignment, and they have to cite themselves, which they all then think is kind of funny. But I tend to be a little bit more lenient about that, because I do think, in some aspects, you've done the work, and if you did a good piece of work and you can use that to help you further new learning, that's okay. Or on the PG cap, I allow, because I teach the assessment and feedback course and the course design in your discipline course, which are 2 phase 1 courses that everyone has to take, but they link really well. If you take the assessment and feedback course and you design your 2 assessment briefs, then of course you can use those in your course design assessment, because you've done that. And I want that practical connection. I want the time you spent on that assessment to help you with this assessment. But I think that is a very specific instance, and those very specific links have to be made. And if they're not, then yeah, then you can't just turn in a paper that you wrote for me to Mary, because that's not right. But again, explaining that they'd have to cite it and use it the same way they would any other piece of academic writing that they're citing, I think can help with that. Because yeah, a lot of them don't think about that. They're like, well, I can't plagiarize myself, can I? You can.
I have.
Some of us
In
have.
the past, I didn't realize. Yeah.
And I think anytime you can relate, any experiences that you have. So yeah, I relate stories about self-plagiarism, or not checking everything as carefully and making sure all the inverted commas were in the right place, or all the the reference list, forgetting to put full references. So anytime you can also relate and show your students too, like, we're all human. You're not going to get it perfect 100% of the time, especially if this is your first time. And letting them see that this is part of the learning process. That's why they work on the formative tasks. That's why they need to read the feedback you provide them. Just really helps them get engaged, kind of with that process. And anything you can do to get them engaged with that will also help them engage with your assessments, engage with the learning in a deeper way, in a different way, and hopefully feel less of a need. Unfortunately, we can't control everybody, but if we can cut down the instances and make it a little bit harder for them, then that's what we're here to do. And with that, you have survived your hour with me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You'll notice that Julia's put a link in the chat. I will also include that in the email, so it goes out to everybody just in case. And hopefully now you'll get started thinking about some meaningful assessments you may do. I'll send you that list so you'll have all the different activities you may want to do. I am always happy to answer questions. So if you start doing things and you're not sure if you're headed in the right direction, or you just want somebody else to have a look over it, send it my way. I am very nosy and very much enjoy looking at what people do across the campus. You can also always contact your college contact, and they can also be on hand to provide some feedback for you, but you can always email me. I'm more than happy. And with that, run away, go back into the wild, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Kim.
Kim. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.